listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. The war in the Middle East has escalated significantly in the last week. The US has moved troops into Israel. UN peacekeepers have been injured in Lebanon. Israel is preparing to attack Iran, and we've witnessed unspeakable horrors in Gaza.
If Israel, in responding to Iran's missile attacks from early October, attacks Iran's nuclear facilities, then I think that regional war will happen. If they attack something else, which is what the US and others have encouraged them to do in response, then we might be able to avoid it.
This morning, our explainer on all the latest major developments in the growing conflict and what could happen next. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Antoinette Lattouf. It's Wednesday, the 16th of October.
Hey, Sasha. G'day, everyone. The Albanese government will today announce its plans to crack down on unfair and dodgy trading practices, with subscription traps and drip pricing at the top of the list, as well as dynamic pricing. So if you're wondering what on earth I'm talking about, this all pertains to transactions and subscriptions online. So subscription traps are those things that make it really hard to cancel a subscription. And drip pricing is that thing that happens when extra fees are slowly added at each step of the purchase so that you only fully realise the final jacked up price at checkout. And they're also wanting to crack down on sites requiring customers to set up accounts for purchases, not requiring one. Online marketing ploys aim to confuse or overwhelm, and that tactic that, the one that creates this false sense of urgency, like those warnings putting time limits on a purchase at checkout.
I do, and I have fallen prey to them as well, Antoinette. Look, another big one will be around dynamic pricing. That's been in the news recently, and we did a deep dive on it last Wednesday. The plan is to ban the practice completely after criticism around recent ticket sales for bands like Green Day and events like the Australian Open. Anthony Albanese and Treasurer Jim Chalmers will reveal the specifics today, saying it still requires consultation, but they've dubbed it a cost of living relief measure. This is really similar to what we talked about in the headlines. Chris and I talked about yesterday in relation to the scrapping of debit card surcharges. It seems like they're on the warpath with this sort of thing. So interesting to see that tactic as we get closer to the election. Keeping with the politics theme, Anthony Albanese he's facing a little bit of backlash at the moment, Antoinette, after purchasing a $4.3 million clifftop home on the New South Wales Central Coast, which is a lovely beachy area. He has had to kind of come out and defend the move. It's been labelled tone deaf. One person who remained anonymous and texted his opinion or her opinion to a reporter, we don't know what side of politics they were on, but they were a politician. They compared it to Scott Morrison going to Hawaii during the 2019-2020 bushfires.
Which, stop it.
I think is, probably
That's
little bit of a reach. But we did hear from Peter Dutton. Here's what he had to say.
They're obviously planning for their next stage of life post-politics, and I wish them well in that.
What do you reckon, Antoinette?
Yeah, look, I don't really reckon he's wishing them well. I'm thinking he's wishing that they lose the next election and that Albanese retires. That to me is what the message I got. But you know what? I just think this is a bit of a beat up. Like, I know that's an expensive property. Albo's in his early 60s. He's had a long career. Jody works as well. I don't think we should be getting too narky about what our Prime Minister lives in or purchases unless there's some kind of wrongdoing, or even if they're exploiting a policy like negative gearing, which we know contributes to decreased housing supply and increased cost of housing. But I mean, he's the PM. He can live on the Central Coast if he wants to.
Changing pace now as we head to Gaza, where another 40 people have been killed in a single day as the death toll continues to mount. Israel is continuing to bombard northern parts of the Strip, with the UN claiming the new offensive has forced the closure of water wells, bakeries, medical points and shelters, and risks cutting the north off from the rest of Gaza completely. The IDF claims it is rooting out Hamas fighters that have regrouped in the area.
Yeah, we've had them use that line, we're rooting out Hamas, we're targeting Hamas. And unfortunately, what we're also continuing to witness is the death toll and the devastation impacting civilians, impacting journalists, aid workers and doctors. Among the spots under siege, a refugee camp in Jabalia, which has been subject to 10 days of carpet bombing. And meantime, the US has written to Israel ordering it to urgently increase access to humanitarian aid in Gaza in the next 30 days, or face having its military assistance cut. There are some suggestions that this is the strongest written warning by the Biden administration to its ally, but I can't help but point out that it comes just days after the US announced it was sending 100 troops and anti-missile technology to Israel. So I call bollocks on that.
Fair point. Hey, look, we've also heard more from Palestinian refugee advocates about the planned Australian visa changes for people fleeing the conflict. We did talk about this yesterday. So just to quickly recap, the government is introducing a two-step process that would see an individual initially granted a humanitarian temporary visa initially. That doesn't give them Medicare access. They'll then be invited to apply for a temporary humanitarian concern visa, which would be valid for 3 years. Now, these advocates, they have welcomed a pathway for humanitarian visas, but they do say that a more permanent option needs to be made available because the only way to guarantee safety for people fleeing conflicts like what is happening in the Middle East and happening in Gaza is through permanent residency in a safe haven country like Australia.
Yeah, and just for context, Sasha, about 1,300 Palestinians with visitor visas have resettled in Australia since last October, but their visa hasn't so far allowed them for work or given them work or study rights. And for context and to compare that to the Ukraine, at that time, 4,000 visas were granted. And as we know, the scale of the humanitarian crisis and the level of devastation is far greater in Gaza. There are just 3 weeks to go till the US election, so let's have a look at the state of play right now. Ever since Harris took over from Biden as the Democratic nominee, polls have been showing a very tight race between her and Trump. However, there is some recent polling suggesting she's losing ground, and this may come as a surprise to some because she's losing ground with Black and Latino voters, especially men.
Barack Obama on the campaign trail even kind of issued this warning to black men saying that maybe they were afraid to vote for a woman, which I thought was an interesting approach. But in a bid to lure this cohort back, Harris has announced a number of proposals targeting them, including things like forgivable loans, job opportunities, and apprenticeships specifically for black men. She's also agreed to an interview with Fox News, which is famously right-leaning. She's going to do an interview with this prolific Detroit podcaster. I think that's today or tomorrow our time, who is very popular with the young black male community in the state. And there's also rumours that she's in talks to sit down with Joe Rogan on his podcast. So very interesting scope of males that she is going to sit down with potentially and do these interviews with. Look, meantime, Donald Trump's campaign is trying to win over female voters. Today, he's going to tape a town hall in Georgia with an all-female audience. He's also cancelled a mainstream news interview. This is the second time in a month he's done this, and this one is with CNBC, Antoinette.
Yeah, there were some articles interviewing black and Latino men about what it is about Trump that is appealing to him or more appealing than voting for the Democratic nominee. And it is the idea or the feeling that he would better handle the economy. And one quote that stuck out to me, and that's that, we'd never want to have a beer with him, but we think he has the tools to lift them up economically. So it is this perception that Trump may be better for the economy.
And the Socceroos have managed not to lose or win in their World Cup qualifier against Japan overnight, coming away with a 1-1 draw. Our boys didn't have a single shot on target, and the goals that were scored for both teams were own goals. There was this overall sense of achievement, though, in the fact that they walked away with a point, which after last week's win against China puts the Aussies in second place behind Japan in the qualifying group.
Yeah, so the Aussie men's national team, they've never won in Japan. And it was so close to being a historic night because the Japanese own goal happened earlier in the game, but it was Cameron Burgess putting the ball in our own net at the 76th minute. And there was also some pre-game drama because the Socceroos bus was late to arrive. It arrived just 49 minutes before kickoff, so it gave them about half an hour to warm up. And there was a request to delay the start time by both the Aussie and Japanese officials, which were rejected. And there was a tweet that stood out. If the Socceroos win tonight, no one should ever warm up before sport again. Well, that obviously didn't play out. It almost did if it wasn't for the own goal at the 76th minute.
Yeah, you're probably right there. Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's positive. Given that we've never won in Japan, to get a draw there, I think that's pretty good. But yeah, so we're under the new stewardship of Tony Popovich. So a win and a draw out of 2, it's not too bad for him. Hey, Antoinette, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines. Next up, we are getting into our explainer that's looking at what is going on in the Middle East right now, all the developments you need to be across, and what could happen next.
Hi, Bension here. The war in the Middle East has escalated significantly in recent days. Israel is now fighting on several fronts: Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Gaza, and it's now preparing for what could be a major assault on Iran. The United States, for its part, has sent about 100 troops to Israel to operate a missile defence system. And the Australian government has updated its travel warnings, now advising any Australian in Israel to get out while it's still safe to do so. Meanwhile, many of us have seen some of the most horrific footage of real human suffering in our lifetimes. On social media, images of people in hospital beds under tents in Gaza in the process of being burnt alive as people nearby watch on helpless. To give us an update on where everything stands and what might happen next in this conflict, we're joined by Jen Parker. She's a Navy veteran of more than 20 years and an expert associate at the National Security College at the Australian National University. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing. Why is the US sending troops to Israel now?
Right, so just to clarify, what the US is actually sending is the THAAD missile system. The THAAD missile system is effectively an anti-ballistic missile system that looks to intercept ballistic missiles at high altitudes and at long range. Now, it's a pretty complex system, and it's not a system that Israel operates. So to operate that system, the US is sending about 94, 95 troops, depends on the reporting, to operate that system. That system consists of both radars and missile interceptors. And the point of that system is to bolster the air defences that Israel has been operating, what is commonly referred to as their Iron Dome system.
There's been a whole lot of developments over the past week. Can you take us through what's happened?
It is a situation that continues to deteriorate. Of course, we've just seen the 12-month anniversary of, a very sad anniversary, to be honest, of the October 7 attacks where Hamas fighters attacked Israel, and obviously the subsequent carnage and the significant loss of life in Gaza. We've also seen Israel continue to prosecute its land campaign to the north of Israel across the Lebanese border. And this has been escalating for about a month now. You might remember there was a number of pager explosions. It led to radio explosions. It led to an air bombing campaign of Israel across Lebanon, trying to take out Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah is broadly a militant group. It also has a political arm. Some of its elements are part of the Lebanese government, but it is not the Lebanese army. In the last week, what has happened is the land campaign has progressed to some of the areas where the UNIFIL, which is the UN peacekeepers, have some of their posts. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Hezbollah has been building for a while now infrastructure near the bases and posts of UNIFIL, thinking that if they're near the peacekeepers, they can attack Israel, but it will provide them some protection. The result of that is that peacekeepers have been injured. Now, what exactly has happened in those situations isn't entirely clear. Certainly, the UN has said it's unacceptable, and it is unacceptable. It's a breach of international law to target peacekeepers. Israel has said that they were targeting Hezbollah posts right next to the peacekeepers. Israel has called for the peacekeepers to leave. The UN has said that that is not going to happen. That has been one of the clear major developments. We've also seen Hezbollah continue to attack Israel across the Lebanese border. And Israel has had a quite successful campaign of shooting down rockets, drones and missiles using what is known colloquially as their Iron Dome system. It is a much more complex system. It has 3 different key elements, but using the Iron Dome system. That system has actually been more successful than anyone would have predicted. What that has meant is that most of the Hezbollah rocket and drone attacks and missile attacks into Israel have not largely been successful. However, Hezbollah has managed to get some drones through. They've attacked a base in Israel just outside of Haifa, where there's been about 70 soldiers injured and a loss of life. Bubbling away in the background is this conversation about Iran. So it is known that Iran does fund and in fact established Hezbollah in 1982 during the Lebanese Civil War. It is known that they fund Hamas to a degree and funnel weapons to them. They also fund other proxies across the region. On the 1st of October, in response to a number of suspected Israeli assassinations of Iranians, but also Hezbollah and Hamas leadership, Iran attacked Israel with about 180 missiles. Israel has said that they intend to respond, but they haven't responded yet. And there's been a lot of conversation about how they might respond. That response might entail targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, but there has been a lot of concerns that they are on the path to achieving them, and a lot of statements this year about the fact that they're not complying with the International Atomic Agency safeguards. So there is concern that Israel might attack that, or their oil facilities, or something else. If we go back to your question about the US deployment, it's very clear that that THAAD system, which is about shooting down ballistic missiles, it's very clear that the US thinks that something further is probably going to come from Iran, because that system isn't designed to shoot down the kind of missiles and rockets and drones that Hezbollah are using. It's about high-tech ballistic missiles, which really Iran has that capability.
So the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia has upgraded its travel advice in relation to Israel, telling Australians to get out now while it's safe to do so. This war has been going on for a long time. Why are they saying it now?
One reason could be that Hezbollah is continuing to attack Israel. And although Hezbollah has been attacking Israel since the 8th of October, so the day after the Hamas attack, they had been lobbing rockets effectively into northern Israel. It had caused some loss of life, and there was a horrific incident with a number of children on a soccer field who were killed. But it wasn't causing a wider threat to Israel, the main cities like Tel Aviv, etc. That has changed, and we've seen longer range attacks from Hezbollah. But I broadly suspect it's because the government thinks that there is going to be something between Israel and Iran. I mean, Israel's been very clear that they're going to respond. They have the capability to do so. It looks like the US is predicting that they're going to respond and Iran will respond in kind. And I think it is the dynamic between Iran and Israel and the potential of that going into a much larger conflict which has prompted the government to say this.
The US has sent these troops in this system. They've also sent warships. And there's been this debate as to whether or not doing these things is dampening the potential wider conflict or escalating it. What do you think?
Look, I do think that the deployment of the additional aircraft carrier and the additional ships has actually acted as a deterrent from Iran. In April, when they attacked Israel with about 300 missiles and drones, they very clearly signalled it, and they let some of their Arab neighbours know it was going to happen. That allowed for the US using those forces they've surged, and the UK and Jordan and Israel to shoot those down. So there really wasn't any loss of life. Sadly, I think there was one person who died, but beyond that, right, 300 missiles and drones. So I think that because the US has surge forces there, it has been a warning to Iran, and Iran has kept their responses to what they see as Israeli attacks. So, Israel in April bombed their embassy in Syria, which is where we get to the Iranian response in April. I do think that they have kept them within certain bounds because of the presence of US forces and the impact they could have on Iran if they stepped too far. Secondly, I think those US forces have been critical to defending Israel both during the April attacks and also the 1st of October attacks this year of Iranian missiles on Israel. They have been critical in shooting them down. And we know that, for example, some of the warships in the Mediterranean intercepted some of Iran's ballistic missiles.
People have been talking for months and months about curbing the possibility of a wider regional war. Israel is now fighting on so many fronts. There's Hezbollah, Lebanon, Iran, Syria, the Houthis, there's Hamas. Is this already the regional war that people have been fearing?
I don't think it is. Now, the regional war we're talking about is something that fully involves Iran, and if it involves Iran in terms of a major conflict, it will involve the constriction of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the only entry into the Persian Gulf and where a lot of the world's crude oil transits through, including crude oil that supports Australia's fuel system. If Iran is pulled into this war, they, I suspect, would respond by attacking US bases in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and potentially in Jordan. That is the wider regional conflict that a lot of people are concerned about, and I think, hopefully will not evolve. If Israel, in responding to Iran's missile attacks from early October, attacks Iran's nuclear facilities, then I think that regional war will happen. If they attack something else, which is what the US and others have encouraged them to do in response, then we might be able to avoid it. And that regional war, I think, is something that Iran is not seeking. We can see that because they would probably be largely unsuccessful. But it might be something that Israel pushes because there is this concern about Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state. In June this year, Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said that Iran had gotten to the point that they could produce fissile material to support nuclear weapons within 1 to 2 weeks if they chose to do so. There's a lot of predictions out there about how long it would take Iran to develop a nuclear weapon if they chose to do so, between 6 months to maybe 2 years. But I think that's also underpinning this, which is this the opportunity to set back Iran's nuclear weapons program? I mean, it's not quite a nuclear weapons program, but some of their capabilities, and Israel might take that choice. And if they do, we're going to see a much larger regional conflict.
All of these possibilities, if and when Israel retaliates against Iran, if they attack their oil facilities, if they attack their nuclear facilities, it sounds like it will be a very significant escalation. Do you think that might necessarily bring countries like Australia into it if the US ends up becoming an even more significant player than it already is?
No, I don't think so at this stage. I think Australia will play a peripheral role, as it always does, supporting some of the command and control across the Middle East. And, in October, we deployed a command team to support the Combined Maritime Forces dealing with the Houthis in the Red Sea. I don't think Australia will be pulled into it, but there will be a significant effect on the Australian economy, right? And one example is the fact that Australia imports 91% of its fuel. We don't even comply with the IEA standards on how much fuel we should keep. And in a refined state, that comes from Southeast Asia, because we've shut down most of our fuel refineries. But in an unrefined state, a lot of that comes from the Middle East. And so I think there will be impacts on the Australian economy, but I can't see Australian forces being drawn into that conflict.
Many of us in the past 48 hours have seen some of the most horrific images out of Gaza that we've ever seen. It seems that there's almost no limit to the violence the Israeli Defence Force is willing to inflict on civilians to meet its aims. The International Court of Justice has found there's a plausible case of genocide. What could countries like Australia and others be doing to stop the killing in Gaza?
Look, this is a really, really difficult one. Of course, the loss of lives in Gaza is absolutely unacceptable. And we're probably only seeing a fraction of it because, of course, there's reporting about targeting of journalists, etc., etc. Australia has been calling for a ceasefire both in Gaza but also in Lebanon and continues to call for one. I'm not actually sure at this point there is much more that Australia could do. I know there's been a lot of commentary about Australia should be stopping supplies of weapons to Israel, but Australia doesn't supply weapons to Israel. That's been a bit of a misinformation that has gotten out there into the community. So I think continuing to call for a ceasefire, continuing to highlight how the loss of life is unacceptable and disproportionate is key. But I think we need to be realistic too in terms of Australia's ability to influence some of these world events, and it is fairly limited.
Is that really the case, though? Because there are diplomatic things that we could do. We could be sanctioning particular individuals. We could be calling in ambassadors. We could be stopping exporting weapons parts, even if we're not exporting weapons in full. Aren't those actions that Australia could be taking that it's not taking right now?
So Australia doesn't export weapons parts directly to Israel at all. There was some reporting recently of, I think it was a Green senator held up, put a photo on Twitter of a drone shield weapon and said that was a gun. It's not a gun. It's a jamming system. Australia really doesn't do that. In terms of calling in ambassadors, yes, absolutely. In terms of sanctioning individuals, yes. Is that going to have an impact on the current situation? To be honest, the answer is no. Don't get me wrong, I think Australia should continue to condemn what is happening on all sides and call for a ceasefire, but I don't think that the Australian government is in a position to really influence the outcome of what is occurring over there at the moment.
Okay, Jen Parker, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you very much.
Jen Parker there. Jen is a Navy veteran of more than 20 years and expert associate at the National Security College at the Australian National University. And Amnesty International says that because of Australia's opaque approval process for arms transfers, it's impossible to verify government claims that no arms are being sent to Israel at all. But it is possible ammunition made in Victoria is making its way indirectly to Israel via the US. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.